Now we're still on this topic of containerization. So we've spent quite a bit of time on it actually, and there will be one more week on it, at least anyway. Although we won't leave the topic entirely when we move on to the next topic after that, which is something called CI/CD. So I want to finish off or continue with these slides here this morning, and there's a lab this week, and this is the first lab that you will be submitting. Although what you need to submit is something quite small, but it's going to be essentially a reference to your Docker Hub repository. So I can have a look, because in this week's lab, you will be putting some of your own images uh, up into Docker Hub. Okay, so let's continue with these slides here. Now, so far, we've been using lots of images, but they've all been um, images that we've pulled down from Docker Hub, as it turns out, from the kind of public library that's available to us. But eventually, we'd want to be able to create contain images of our own applications for two reasons. One, so that we can deploy our application. Containerization is one way of deploying an application. It's not the only way, though. And the second reason we would want to create images of our own applications is so that we can share them with other members of our team or the wider community. So if I skip on down to the section on building images. So how do we do it? I've kind of alluded to as to why we want to do it. How do we do it? Number one, we just have to create a special file in our project folder. The file name is prescribed. It's called Docker file. And inside that file, we put a set of directives or instructions for the Docker daemon, I guess. So that's step one. Step two then is you issue a Docker build command. And in the build command, what we say is you tag, which really means you name your image, you give it a name. Now we know that the name is comprised of a name in the conventional sense, but also we've kind of got to give it a version or a version number, which is kind of this part here. Although, if only to confuse us, that this part is often referred to as the tag as well. So tag seems to have multiple meanings. Some people refer to this as the tag, or they refer to the entire part as the tag. But let's not get bogged down on that. Now, and in the build tag command, you've got to essentially tell it where is the Docker file, and the dot, in my case anyway, and in most cases, the dot means that go look for the Docker file in the current folder. So we tend to issue this command in the base folder of our project. Up to now, we've been using the Docker command, and it doesn't really matter where we are on our file system, mainly because we're communicating with the Docker daemon, and we're communicating with kind of Docker Hub when we pull down an image. Okay, so we create a Docker file, and that has, as I said, that has a set of directives or instructions on how to build the image. Now, if you remember way back when I started talking about Docker, and I was defining what I mean by an image and what I mean by a container. Remember, an image is essentially the entire file system uh, that you want to have present in the container when the container is running. So it's the entire file system associated with the running of an application Now, that file system would include obviously the code that makes up the application, but also any third-party dependencies. So if it was a JavaScript application, it would be the node modules folder. Also, any operating system utilities or libraries that are needed, they're also included in the image. And finally, uh, the environment variable settings that need to be present when the image is actually executed. And by executed, we mean creating a container based on that image. Um, okay, so I'm just mentioning some points here that number one, you've got to place the Docker file in the base folder of your application, in the project base folder, that's fine. Uh, Point two, okay, it's nice to know, but you don't have to necessarily kind of rationalize it. But as it turns out, when we're building an image, so we talk about building an image and running a container. When we're building an image, what is actually happening behind the scenes is that for each instruction in the Docker file, the Docker daemon creates a container in order to execute the instruction in the Docker file. And then it takes a snapshot of that container or a kind of a freezing of the container. So it is actually creating multiple containers as it works its way down through the instructions in your Docker file. That's what's happening behind the scenes, coincidentally, right? So there's lots of temporary containers being created as it's building your image. Uh, and an image is something that we might build multiple times, for two reasons why we might build it multiple times. One is we might want to make changes to the Docker file. And the second one, which is probably more frequent, when we actually want to make changes to the source code of our application. We have to rebuild the image all over again. But the rebuilding might include some of the same steps, definitely would include some of the same steps as the very first time we built the application. And so what Docker actually does is it caches the various temporary containers that it would have created the first time it built the image. So it's doing a lot of caching behind the scenes. And what that really means is that subsequent builds actually run a bit faster than the very first build that you do on your application. Obviously, every time you rebuild your application, you have to give it a different, sorry, one second now. You have to give it a different kind of version. Yeah. There's no sense of overwriting a version. It has to be a new one every time, a new value every time, a new number, I guess, if it's just a numeric value. So, I mean, the very simplest example of a Docker file I'm showing you here, right? Every Docker image is built on top of an existing image. And so in this very simple Docker file here, I'm saying I want to start with the Nginx image, which you will pull down from Docker Hub. And then I want to add this instruction or command to the creation of my image. So my image is going to be based on the Nginx image, but then I'm making this change to the image. And it looks like what I'm doing is I'm copying a file from my project, index.html file, and I'm copying it into a folder in the image. This folder here will actually already exist because if you looked at the Nginx image, it will have a folder with that as its path name. So I'm copying a file from my project in my VS Code, and I'm copying it into the file system of the image that is based on Nginx. That's it. That's my image completed. So where we actually can use that is if I go back to the website and if I look at the very first lab that we did, and if I fast forward to this part, you might remember when we executed this command in the lab. So you now know that what we're doing here is we want to run, Docker run means create a container. The container, if I scroll over, the container is based on this image here, which is an image that it gets from Docker Hub, but it's an Nginx image. And if you remember, this part here is where we essentially gave the Nginx image, we gave it a link to a folder on our host machine. And that folder, and we're linking that folder on our host machine. In other words, this folder here, we're linking that folder on our host machine to a particular directory within the Nginx image. And that is essentially the same as what we were doing in the copy command that I had on the PowerPoint slides there. Here, what I'm showing you here is the Nginx image uh, runs inside a container, and that container has access to a folder on our host machine, and that folder on our host machine is linked to this folder inside in the Nginx image. Now, if I go back to my slides, the only thing that's different here is that I'm actually copying a single file in this case, but it could be multiple files. I'm copying a file into the exact same uh, directory within the Nginx image. And I'm doing that at build time when I'm building my own image. Yeah. So I could actually let's actually just do that. So if I go into my VS Code, here's an index.html file. Now there could be JavaScript files here as well, which are referenced from my index.html. Just I'm keeping it simple in this case, but so there could be a whole bunch of files here. Here's a Docker file, and it has the same two instructions in this case. I'm using a particular version of Nginx. The version number isn't really important. And I'm copying ./index.html. The dot slash obviously means from the current folder in my host. And I'm copying it over to this path name in the image, in the Nginx image, in order to create my new image. I'm not changing the Nginx image. You can't do that. I'm actually making a change to my image, which is being built on top of the Nginx image. So that's my Docker file. And if I just run the command docker run, sorry, docker build, -t to give it a name. So I call it my website. Give it a version. And the dot here means you'll find the Docker file in the current folder. So is that going to work? Yeah. Okay, so it's off building the image. So I've called the image my website. So if let's use the GUI for convenience. If I go into my images, And let's do a search for something that begins with my. So there's my image now. And now I can run a container based on that image. So let's do that. It runs in the background. Now, because we know it's actually based on the Nginx, it's based on the Nginx image, and we have to do a port mapping. Sorry, that's getting in the way. We have to do a port mapping. So I will say port 3000 on the host. 3000 maps to port 80 in the container because I know the Nginx server is running on port 80. And give it the name of the image, which in this case is my website, 1.0. Am I leaving anything out? I wonder. Let's have a go. Okay, let's now look at to see what containers I have. Is there a container called site? There it is there. And it has a port mapping. So if I click on that, and voila, I get my website. And this corresponds to the contents of my HTML. Yeah, that looks right. So that's the process. Create your Docker file, build your image based on the Docker file, and it's as straightforward as that, I guess. So all that remains then is to maybe have us look through some of the most common directives or commands that you put into a Docker file. Just pause for a second in case there are any questions so far. No? Okay, so every Docker file is going to have the from directive, and I've kind of already explained that because every time you want to create an image of your own, it has to be based on some existing image. It doesn't have to be based on an image that you pull down from Docker Hub. It could be based on some other image that you have belonging to yourself. But ultimately, if we worked out, if we were building an image based on some other image that we own, it's more than likely that that other image would be based on an image that we pull down from the public library on Docker Hub. And there's a large library up there. Okay, so it sets the base image for our newly created image. That's fine. Um, Another very common directive is the copy directive, which we've also already seen. And what that does is it copies files from the host to the image that you want to build to the images file system. So we've seen that already. And you can the source I'm saying can contain wildcards if you want to create copy multiple files. The destination, if the destination doesn't exist, it's created. The destination being in the image itself. And here are some examples of copy commands, all of which are valid copy commands. Again, fairly straightforward. The CMD instruction or directive, what that does is it specifies, I'm saying, the default startup command to execute at container runtime. So when we run our, when we ask Docker to create a container based on our image, it will essentially, set up the file system inside the container, but then it will run some command at the end of that process. And the command it runs is whatever we specify in the CMD directive. Now, you might have noticed in the very simple Docker file that I created, this one here, there is no CMD, but that's because if we looked inside this image, it does have a CMD directive, and the CMD, which is short for command, the command directive tells it to start up the Nginx web server. Okay, so that's why when I did a local host to 3000, I was sending a request to the web server that is running inside in my image, but the web server was started by the base image. But in 99% of cases, you will have a CMD directive in your Docker file. And we'll see an example, certainly in this week's lab, and I'll show you an example as well in the lecture a little bit later on. It tends to be the CMD directive tends to be the very last line in your Docker file, because at that stage all of the other direct instructions have been performed. So your image has been sort of completely created in terms of its file system and environment. And the last thing you might want to do is to execute some command or have the container execute some command. In fact, I'm kind of showing you here actually. This is very similar to the CMD directive in the Nginx image itself. This is how you kind of start the Nginx server. Yeah. The general form is what's the name of the executable that you want to run, and what are the parameters that you want to pass to that executable. Uh, Now, you can, even if an image does have a CMD directive, you can override it, and you can override it when you run the docker run command. Um, we haven't seen an example of that, but you can, at the very end of the docker run command, you can actually specify some executable and parameters to that. I could actually, maybe I could demonstrate it actually. Let's see. If I start up a second container, I'm not sure now if this is going to work, but let's see. And I'm going to call the second container site 2. And let's supposing I want to run the ls command, which is uh, list all the contents of a folder, and I'll just go ls flash. Okay. And I had a hunch that wasn't going to work in this case. Let's see, what's it saying to me? Okay, it just doesn't happen to work for that Nginx image. Okay, I probably should have prepared that a little bit better. Okay, let's just move on from it. We don't tend to do it that often, but it can be done. Right, the run command or the run directive in a Docker file, what that allows you to do is to execute some command during the building of your image. Okay, so it executes the command, whatever command you specify here, and there can be parameters to the command as well. It executes that command inside the container during the build process. Okay. Um, Now you may want to actually run a number of commands. inside the container during the build process. And rather than having a number of individual run commands, you can kind of tie them all together just using this and directive. So it looks like here I want to run this command, and I want to run this command, and I want to run this command, all as part of the building of my application. Sorry, the building of my image, beg your pardon. Okay. The env directive is if you want to set up some environment variables which will be present then when you run a container based on that image. And environment variables tend to be very important for most images. So you can declare environment variables and initialize those environment variables inside in your Docker file. And whatever environment variables you declare in the Docker file, those environment variables will then be available at runtime within the container. And so this is how it looks. It's just the env keyword, the name of the environment variable, the value for it, and you can have any number of environment variables. They, these environment variables can also be overwritten at container runtime. And we would have seen a lot of that up to now. Again, if I go back to the website and let's see, did we see it in this one? Maybe not. Let's go to another one. Yeah, we definitely saw it here. So you can see here, right? We're using the -e option. So we're setting an environment variable uh, for our container. Now it's possible if we did have access to the particular image that we're using here, which is this image, again, which we pulled down from Docker Hub, there may be default values for these environment variables. I'm setting a number of them here. There may have been default values, but we're actually overriding the default values with our specific values. Okay, so we know now how to set environment variables default values for environment variables in a container. We use the env command or the env directive in the Docker file. But how you override them is using the -e option in the Docker run command. That's fine. The add directive in a Docker file, pretty obvious, I guess. It adds files to the image. Now, where those files come from, it could be from the host machine itself. But what's different between add and copy? Add and copy seem to do the same thing. They put additional files into the image's file system. The difference is that with add, you can actually use a URL as the argument of the add, and whatever file is being referred to is being referenced from the URL. That file is actually downloaded and put into your image. You can also, okay, so it's an example, that's fine. Okay, I'm CDing into that. That's okay, I think. Downloaded, e.g. that. Another option is if you want to, um, you can specify a tar, which is a sort of an archive file in the add instruction, and in that case, it will unzip the tar file and place the contents of the archive in your image. So it's a bit more has a bit more to it than just a straightforward copy. So here it looks like we want to add the contents of this archive file. We want to add it to this particular directory in our image. That's the add. Uh, the work dir directive is when we want to set a default path within our image. Um, and so any commands that follow the work dir directive, um, those commands, if they have relative path names in the actual image itself, it will be relative to whatever you set work dir path to be. So the example is we are saying set the default directory to /user/app. So this is the default directory that I want to have associated with my image. And then I'm doing a copy and I'm copying it to the dot directory in the image. This is the destination. So dot now means this path here. Yeah. So it's just a convenience, I think, to use work there rather than having to type in /user/app here and in any subsequent commands. Anytime we want to refer to /user/app, we can just use dot. Now, if I go back to VS Code, and this is what you will, one of the parts of this week's lab, what I'm showing you here is the profile, the user profile app that you have been using in previous labs. Yeah. So it's just a web application, a server-side rendering web application. So you've seen all this code before, but here I have a Docker file now added to it, and you will be doing it in this week's lab. So let's have a scan down through the Docker file. In this case, I'm basing the Docker image that I want to create. I'm basing it on an image that contains an installation of the Node platform. And I'm just picking out a particular version, right? So I want to build an image. Essentially, I want to build an image that already has the Node and NPM already installed on it. And there are lots and lots of them up on Docker Hub. That's fine. Then it looks like I'm declaring a whole bunch of environment variables. And the reason I'm declaring many of those is because, as you know, if I actually look inside the source code of my application into the database folder inside an index.js, I'm using environment variables right across here. Okay. So I need to set those environment variables somewhere. And it looks like I'm setting default values for them in my Docker file. Then I'm running a command inside the image. So looks like I want to create a new folder in the image itself, in the image's file system. The -p means create it if it doesn't exist. So that's fine. Then I set my default directory in the image to that particular path. Then I'm copying everything from the app folder. In other words, if I look over here, all of this stuff here, I'm going to copy all of that over to dot. Dot, of course, now means copy it over into this directory. Then I run npm install. Now, the copy command up here, right? This copy command would have included the copying of package.json, this guy. But of course, I need to actually install the various third-party dependencies, the Node packages that are specific to this application. I need to install them in this image. So that's why I'm running npm install. Now the npm command is going to be fine because that will be included in the node base image that this Docker file is based on. So I'm running npm install. I didn't include this in the slides, but the expose directive um, tells the container, any container that is going to be executed based on this image to expose port 3000. And port 3000 just happens to be the port that I am using as the port for this web application. It happens to correspond to that environment variable. So that's expose. And here's the CMD. And the CMD is running the node platform and telling it run this file, um, which is, as we know, is the server file for our web application. And there's no path name required here now for this because this file will be inside in this folder. And because we set workdir to that folder, we do not have to specify where exactly is this server.js. So having carried out all of these instructions here, a container will eventually run this command at the very end of the container creation in order to start up my web server. So if I now build an image using that Docker file, Docker build again, and I call it my node app. Doesn't always have to be 1.0, but can't come up with anything other sensible. So my node app, and again, don't forget the dot at the end. And away it goes. And in fact, what you're seeing here is the intermediate containers that are being created as it's building the image. So I should now have, if I look at my local images, here it is, here. And I now need to run a container based on that. And again, I will do a port mapping because this application that the image is based on, as we know, okay, it's running a server that we have developed, and that server is going to be listing on a port. The port is something we can control via environment variables. And if I go back to the Docker file, you could look at the code, but I can tell you that it's this environment variable that determines what port my server application is running on. Now, so to run a container, you can see here in the environment variables, a number of them are kind of empty, right? For security reasons, really, because these environment variables are potentially contain sensitive um, uh, data associated with them. Yeah. And so the environment variables that are just don't have a initial value we would set those environment variables at runtime. And because remember now, this Docker file is just an ordinary file. And if we were pushing this application up into GitHub, then potentially anybody can see the contents of the Docker file and could see the credentials that we are setting here. Okay, so it wouldn't make sense to set them in the Docker file itself. Set them instead at runtime, as I said. Now, if I just use the lab, actually, this week's lab, to find out, well, what is the run command? C. Oh, yeah, here it is here. Okay, so Docker run, set it in run in background mode. Okay, um, I'm running it on a custom network of mine. That's all right. This is the name I want to give to the container. I'm doing a port mapping because I want to be able to access the server that this container is going to be running. I want to be able to access it from the host machine itself. So I'm doing a port mapping, setting some environment variables, and giving it the name of my image. I gave it a different name when I created it just there this minute. But we know a little bit about this particular application and the fact that it uses MongoDB. It communicates with MongoDB. So I need to make sure that the MongoDB server is actually running already. And I think in my case it is actually. Let's see. If I go to my containers, no, doesn't look like it. Thought it was Mongo. No. Okay. Or maybe if I just start off Mongo using this command here. Probably not going to copy and paste now though. Let's see if it does. Okay, that looks good. And also if I start up my application using the image that I've just created, again, I'll just borrow this here. Now I gave my image a different name, so what did I call it? My Node app 1.0. Oh yeah. Just need to give a different name to there seems to be already a container with the same name. So I call it, let me just check that again, sorry, because that container is probably using, it's probably using port 3000. No, it doesn't look like it's, why is it saying, there it is there. So I'm just going to delete that. There now, let's see. Here, still unhappy. What's it like? Let's see, Docker, let's work with this. Gosh, nothing is working. That's there. I know about this. I'll just look at the error. Profile app 3000, 3000. Password that my node app 1.0, and it doesn't like it because portal already allocated. So something else is using port 3000. Let me just try and debug what's going on here. Okay, it's this guy here. So let's get rid of that. Nope. Still unhappy. No. Okay, let's give one more go. Even though I'm getting an error there, the container still exists. So the error that I'm getting right now is because there's already a container with the same name and it won't let me do that. So if I do that, now we're there. And if I find that container, which is this guy, and it's running, and if I see if I can get it, I'm going to do a manual refresh on that. Yeah, okay, so that looks as if it's going for me. Okay, anyway, you will be working through that in the lab. Also in the lab, what you will be doing is creating a Docker hub, and I have instructions as to the username that you choose for your Docker hub account. So make sure you follow those instructions. And then you will be uploading or pushing the images that you have created up to your Docker hub account. Each image, Docker hub talks about repositories in the same way that we talk about repositories in Git and GitHub. So each application will have its associated repository. And of course, you may create multiple images of an application, different versions of it as the application's functionality expands. You'll be creating new images for the updated version of your application. And so inside in a repository, you will see a history of all of the versions of the application's image that you created. Okay, so for now, that's all we really need to know about creating images, which is simply create a Docker file and put your directives or instructions into the Docker file. I've shown you the most common directives. There are others though. And build your image. How you actually upload it to Docker Hub. Uh, there's a, a set of commands that you need to execute in order to do that. But hopefully, I'm explaining that in the lab itself. So again, at the very end, I'll pause for any questions, but I don't seem to be getting questions from me, so that's okay. No, not today either. Right, I will talk to you in tomorrow's. Well, I won't need to talk to you. There won't be a Zoom meeting for the lab tomorrow. I'll just make contact with you over Slack, and then you can send me messages if you're having any problems as you're working your way through the lab. And you do need to submit some details from the lab, but that again, that's explained in the lab instructions itself. All right, I'll leave it at that for now. Talk to you tomorrow, maybe.